I met for the first time in my life Gary at NYU, and that was 15 years ago. That was one of my most pleasant meeting I've ever had. I was at that point studying seriously, or at least try to, global supply chain, and fully understood that lawyers were totally unequipped to understand what the message was coming from that literature. And ever since, I think I fought a battle which ended up in a very pleasant Parisian lunch with Jennifer a few years later, talking about very much the same thing, which is today taking birth. The idea that a real multidisciplinary seminar is something that is still missing. What I see, despite the great power of contributions coming from the different disciplines, especially economic sociology, from Gary and Jennifer, are very important certainly witness. I do see the lack of dialogue, of disciplinary dialogue. And now the traditional way, in this particular case, but be mindful I won't do it, is to propose the creation of a law review or a general review that would put together the scholars. I personally feel, maybe it's because I'm getting old, that before that would happen, if that would happen at all, there's an issue, that there are a couple of issues concerning both the methodology and the content that needs to be worked out. And that is to search for not a common language. I'm convinced that a common language in a field that is so innovative and that progresses at such a high speed is almost an impossible task. But to be able to have an understandable and pragmatic communication among scholars about the pillars of this discussion, that is to see the key notion and concept. If you can tell him, I'm sure Gary could say much more relevant words on this. Even the notion of global supply chain is highly debated both at the international organization level and in the literature, let alone this debate in the legal world, where a real definition of global supply chain is missing in the attempt that Directive 1760 has made to talk about global supply chain is certainly something that is important, but certainly not final and definitive. So I think the first, hopefully not the last credit of this initiative is to be able to start a meaningful conversation among scholars who, on their own, have pursued a dialogue with other disciplines in the field, trying to come up and build a common language that would basically promote the development of a notion which I think has become a key understanding of industrial policy and trade policy, and then for many social sciences, including law, a very important one. On this last point, let me just say that lawyers are probably the ones that are mostly behind this. I've tried in a couple of conferences to convince them that the trade they were talking about, without even mentioning supply chain, takes place for almost 80% within global trade chain. And so to talk about a phenomenon without providing the background of that phenomena and in thinking in Williamsonian terms of a phenomenon that, if at all, is not Williamsonian or Coasian any longer after 50 or 60 years, it's just a nonsense. That chapter stays there in a drawer, hasn't had any success, and I'm very hopeless that my colleagues will ever take seriously the idea that the new unit of analysis should become the global supply chain or the global value chain, both for empirical reasons and for theoretical reasons, and abandon market anarchies as the main pillars of the discussion. Those are, if at all, the hybrids, and global supply chain is the pillar. In any event, these few words help me to introduce certainly the most important innovator in the field, somebody who from 1994, if not before, has been thinking about these issues in one of the most innovative and changeable way. I think many tributes can be given to Gary Jeffrey, but one tribute is certainly his ability to discuss and rediscuss notions and concepts. Many times, incredibly brilliant students tend to develop one brilliant concept and simply repeat over and over and over that same concept for 30 years. I think it should be given to Gary the credit of being somebody who's been able to observe empirically the phenomenon in a way. Today, it is by chance, but it's not by chance. The first book was 1994, so 30 days have passed since that very first and important book. And I think one of the most important things that we should celebrate is Gary's abilities to innovate, to change, to promote new ideas. And let me spell out very briefly three of these ideas that I do consider of paramount importance for the group that we're trying to create. The first one is that despite my plead for the move to a supply chain unit. Supply chain unit is a very diverse concept. There isn't one supply chain. There are many supply chains. And the penta structure of the article of 2005 was only the beginning of a work that has multiplied instead of reducing the amount, the number, the quality of supply chain. But there is one particular aspect which I believe is very important, and it's been so far under investigated, and that is the distinction between north, south, and south-south global supply chains. I've been personally interested in contracting, and I must tell you that, of course, my knowledge is highly limited, and so there must be mass material that I'm missing. Although in the material I am aware of, a real study of architecture of contracting in global South-South chain is missing. That implies that the knowledge that we have of the chains that not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but today have become the most important remains unknown. And that I think both from the theoretical standpoint and practical standpoint is a big hole. It is extremely important that supply chains where the main actors are Brazil, China, India, um, uh, Argentina, Russia, and other actors, um, uh, generally known as the BRICS, become well known. I feel that the current debate, despite many efforts that have been made by Cohen Young and other Yonko Lee and other wonderful scholars, is extremely Euro and US centric. And that compared to what is really happening in practice is a big mistake. So to the extent that this group has the ambition to become a group, global, real global group, it is fundamental that both the research, but also the human capital that participates into the process comes also from land that so far have not participated to the in the debate as much as they should have. The second dimension that Gary, I remember, was in Singapore and he had a full talk on this. Is technology. Um, the role of technology in the development of supply chain has been really studied in the last 4 or 5 years. However, I think not decisive conclusions have been made on both the structure, the length, but also what I consider as a contract scholar the most important thing, the internal relationships within the chain. Technology modifies radically the structure of the links. In fact, modifies the idea of link as such, and modifies by that the interaction among the links within the chain. I think we need a much better understanding of how technology can modify the internal relationships within the chain. And I think that the literature on technology is still a literature that is highly specialized and doesn't really touch upon, especially one notion, which I believe is also very important, and it became thanks to Dallas, Ponton, Sturgeon, and others later on, very important, and that's power. So the relationship between technology and power, I believe, is going to be central. But to my humble understanding, this is something that is not investigated enough. The third and the last, and I'll stop here, is what is happening now. The Directive 1760 2024 a few months ago in Europe, plus many other pieces of legislation in Europe, but also in other countries, opposed an issue that was in place for about 15 years. And again, here there's an issue of language. The relationship between due diligence and global supply chain is a relationship that has not been studied entirely by those who are involved into the supply chain debate. now it has become a must. So it is necessary now that those who study global supply chain study due diligence and compliance, because we move from voluntary to mandatory requirements. And so all the big supply chains now have to be characterized uh, by mandatory due diligence. And mandatory due diligence is likely to modify radically not only the shape of the chain, but also the internal relationship of the chain itself. And most of the dimensions that I mentioned before, including technology and the ways in which monitoring all along the supply chain, going well beyond extraterritoriality, will occur. And so I think the misalignment between powers and liability, the fact that for most of the time the liability was located in primarily upon suppliers, and the chain leaders was basically not liable for the acts and decisions that he or she made for the entire chain, has now changed. Now, the ways in which liability will be distributed across countries, across jurisdictions, for different type activities and commodities is a question mark that is very difficult to solve, given also the fact that in many countries, joint and several liability is a notion that is context specific. So we do not have a general notion of joint and several liability, but we have a plethora of joint and several liability concept that possibly will qualify the ways in which the liability between the chain leaders, the suppliers, and the subcontractors will be held for violations against the impact of the harm. These were just three main points, which I think characterize the open questions for the near future, the challenge the current understanding of the global supply chain, but at the same time build on what Gary has told us for 40 years since his very illuminating contribution of 1994.
Thank you very much. Well, first, it's a real pleasure to be part of this inaugural seminar that is being created at the University of Trento. I really appreciate the introductory remarks of Fabrizio and Paola. And to just pick up a couple points Fabrizio mentioned, he stressed that one of the characteristics of this global value chain approach or literature is its multidisciplinarity. And when I first met Fabrizio, he was one of the first lawyers that was beginning to look seriously at how work on supply chains intersects with work on the law. And he's just given us in his last remarks some of the concepts that lawyers are adding to this, and not just his early work on contracts, but more recently work on joint and distributed liabilities, which Jennifer Baer, who was with us, has also been working on. So I think that's a very important part of the context for this discussion. Two other dimensions that I think are really key for global value chain work. It grew out of people working on development issues, often involved in particular countries and particular industries. And over the 30 years that this literature has been evolving, now we have studies in virtually every region of the world, most countries, and a lot of industries. So part of the challenge when we're trying to identify how this research informs current topics that we're interested in is to maintain a perspective on this comparative breadth. Whatever place we're looking at, how is that place being informed by research in other parts of the world that can be relevant? And a third aspect, and I'll certainly talk about this in my remarks, a great virtue, I think, of global value chains, unlike a lot of theoretical approaches that kind of have rise and falls, is that global value chains has managed to continue to be relevant to continuing changes of topics. It started out when we were looking at offshore production and why certain industries moved offshore and others stayed home, and what the characteristics of offshore production was. But then it went from concerns about topics like who controls these industries to how value is distributed. Then the digital economy came along, and there's a lot of new issues there. And so I think a challenge, but also a great resource of this approach is how can we continue to apply it to the topics we are most interested in today? And I think that's something that I'm going to try to focus on. So let me first pull up the slides if I can. Let me see if I can share these. Okay. Okay, and can people see that main slide there?
Yes, Professor.
Great. Okay, so what I want to try to do is cover several issues rather briefly. Fortunately, I think Paola and Federico and Fabrizio's team have already made available to people in the seminar some background articles that I will be referring to in my presentation. And after the seminar, as they refer, I'd have in a Q&A period. So, okay, and so I want to talk about three things. Basically, one, I want to just talk a little bit more about the building blocks of a global value chain framework and how and why it's become relevant in the current era that has focused a lot on disruptions to global supply chains, especially since COVID-19. Supply chain vulnerabilities and fragmentation have become hot button issues. Second, I want to focus on the link between supply chains and policies, and in particular, the shift between a focus on trade policies, which has been where a lot of the earlier supply chain literature focused, to a current concern with industrial policies. And I'll use some examples from the Biden administration in the US, but obviously that's a very fluid situation in terms of what the policies are today, what they're going to be tomorrow, et cetera. And then I'll just give a couple of illustrations. One from the article that I suggested that was an article I wrote for a special issue of a journal called Journal of International Business Policy. So first, just a bit about background on global value chains. The discussion of the rise of the global value chain economy is tied with the rise of the global economy, and one distinction ties to what trade was largely between countries involving finished goods, and most production was done inside countries. In the so-called New World of Trade, especially beginning around 2000, as companies began to set up international supply chains and had specialized production of different stages of the chain in different countries of the world, more and more trade involved intermediate goods moving back and forth. And so that difference in terms of who controlled trade, whether it was integrated firms and single countries in the old world of trade, or a much larger supply chain in this new world of trade, that gave rise to a set of research questions that the global value chain approach has been focusing on. I think Fabrizio had mentioned that in a UNCTAD study, they estimated that in early 2000s, around 80% of world trade was now moving through these international supply chain networks. And part of that is this rise of intermediate goods trade. And some figures are there that could approach as high as 60% in 2030. Another trend was that as the supply chains were becoming stretched and more broad-based, they were also becoming consolidated in a handful of larger firms in different parts of the supply chain and concentrated in larger countries. So at the same time, we had a kind of decentralization of trade in terms of flows, but concentrations in terms of companies and countries. And that raises a set of research questions like what can small countries do? What does economic upgrading mean? What does social upgrading mean? How do the kind of contractual issues Fabrizio mentioned, how do they operate? These are just 4 terms that sometimes get confused. The basic term of global supply chains is something that all companies recognize, and it's a big part of the international business of literature. Every company has a supply chain that starts with raw materials, goes through different kinds of inputs, final goods, and then from the final goods production, you're sending products to end markets. That notion of the international business side of global supply chains was largely about logistics. Logistics was a field that focused on how can you reduce the time it takes goods to move across that supply chain? How do you guarantee access at critical junctures of that supply chain? How do you lower cost? The global commodity chains literature that Fabrizio had mentioned grew up in the 1990s, and there was a 1994 book called Commodity Chains and Global Capitalism. That introduced a different notion that we could call governance structures, or it said, if we look at these global supply chains or these global industries with their supply chains, how do we understand the role of power in these supply chains? Which firms in the supply chain are controlling that flow of goods and capturing different amounts of value? And the initial big distinction that came out of the global commodity chains literature was a difference between 2 types of supply chains or 2 governance structures. Producer-driven chains, where the manufacturers in large-scale technology-intensive goods, they were in control of how the rest of the supply chain operated. And that would be industries like aircraft, automobiles, mining, oil. Those were the things that were initially being studied. But I think the new insight from the commodity chains literature was that increasingly, as production moved around the world in search of lower cost production points, and those goods were then being sent to rich country markets, we had a new type of supply chain called buyer-driven supply chains, where large retailers like Carrefour or Walmart or Costco, or big brands like Nike, Disney, Reebok, neither of which had their own production facilities, they were in a position to control how the chains operated. And so that was one important difference, that the rise of, let's say, East Asian exports to the rest of the world largely was occurring in buyer-driven chains, consumer goods that we all had that could be made more cheaply elsewhere. When you get to global value chains, which emerged in the early 2000s, that literature added on to the governance structure debate this question of who is capturing value in the chain, and how much value is captured, for example, by Apple, which doesn't have its own factories, but it designs and markets extremely sophisticated and popular high-end electronic goods. And so the question of who captures the value and what role are producing countries getting out of that, that was part of what the global value chains literature introduced. And then finally, there's this realization that even though we talk about global value chains, most value chains actually have a strong regional emphasis, that the trade and production within Europe or within North America or within East Asia is higher than the trade and production that occurs to the rest of the world. So there's games within games. There's a global supply chain set of issues, global value chain. Within that, we have regional chains. Within that, we have national and local chains. And a lot of the work in Italy that's been so well known has been about Italian industrial districts, subnational value chains where a lot of innovation and value creation occurs. So with supply chains, we need to make some of these distinctions more evident. By the way, can you hear me okay now, Jen, or is it still phasing out?
Yes. No, it's great. Thank you.
Okay.
That's much better.
Great. So I just wanted to take us to this current time where, as we know, in 2020, COVID-19 was a global health pandemic that disrupted both the supply side and the demand side of economies all around the world. And it raised these issues of supply chain shortages for lots of different products. So that actually brought this topic of supply chains and supply chain vulnerabilities and supply chain resilience much more center stage. It wasn't just something that international business people worry about in terms of logistics, or that this global commodity chain or global value chain set of scholars were talking about in an isolated fashion. It now started to become linked to national security. In addition to COVID-19 and before it, and since, we've seen that economic nationalism has been on the rise in the world economy for at least the last 10 years. Brexit was one of the first illustrations of that, where the UK decided to withdraw, voted to withdraw from the European Union. Very controversial decision on all fronts. With the initial 2016 Trump administration, he was very keen about trade wars and restoring the strength of the US economy by restricting imports, but a lot of economic nationalism tied to non-economic issues as well, including a lot of anti-immigration sentiment, immigrants coming for different reasons, refugees in war-torn areas, et cetera. So there's a lot going on around economic nationalism. And at the same time, we had these regional trade agreements and multilateral security pacts that were creating alliances between countries. So we have forces that are fragmenting or splitting bigger structures, and other forces that are bringing them together. And so before sort of just giving two examples, just want to review quickly if the building blocks of a global value chain analysis. So if you're going to do this kind of work, you go through at least 4 or 5 steps. I mean, one is this thing that we call global value chain mapping. Whatever industry you're looking at, you typically will find in a global value chain study some sort of value chain map that starts with raw materials, inputs, final products, like the apparel industry that Jennifer and I have worked on for a long time, and then distribution. A key thing with the value chain map is that the place where a finished good is made, let's say a Nike shoe or an Apple iPhone, where it's made is in the middle of the supply chain or of the value chain, because since production is now set up all around the world, the distribution and sale and final markets are other important stages that have to be mapped. So this isn't just an industry map. This is a map that's going from where do you get raw materials, or how do you organize component supply and final production, to how do you distribute products to end markets. Second is this topic of governance structures that I mentioned, which companies in the chain are most powerful. When I mentioned that initial distinction between producer-driven and buyer-driven, those refer to 2 different types of lead firms, or firms at the top of the chain, manufacturers or retailers or brands. More recent supply chain work has been focusing on first tier and even lower tier suppliers that link up to the lead firms. So now we're looking at supply chains in a much more holistic way. Geography, or where the supply chains are located, changes over time. We'll see that in a minute. Very importantly, the value across the supply chain is distributed very unevenly. So if you look at an Apple iPhone, the studies that have been done on value would say that Apple, which does not produce any of its own iPhones, captures maybe 40% of the total retail value of iPhones because of its design and marketing, whereas the points of production in China or elsewhere is maybe only getting 2% of the value of that iPhone. So the questions of value distribution and why they are uneven and how that changes is a critical question. And then finally, we have this state policies are an important dimension. And that's what I'll focus on a bit today, as well as this comparative and longitudinal analysis. So I want to just give two kinds of examples. The first example is referring to the article that I mentioned that Professors Lim and Lee and I wrote in Journal of International Business Policy. And it focuses on these three big industries that were probably the original most popular industries for this literature to study. One was apparel, which is a relatively labor-intensive industry, meaning production was spread to many different countries around the world. It was a very dispersed supply chain. Second was automobiles or automotive, which we might consider mid-level technology. The automobile industry tended to be more regionally concentrated. Europe, North America, Asia all had key automotive producers, but because of the size of automobile production, a lot of it was more regional. And then electronics, which is more high tech. And the focus on this article was, what's the role of trade policies in shaping how these supply chains work? So because you'll have the article to look at later, I just want to be quick in terms of telling you how the article is organized. I mean, how we frame the research questions, and then you could look in more detail later at some of the results. So the key here is, in this particular, since a special issue of JIBP was about role of policies, we focused on trade policies in three global value chains, but we wanted to look at these value chains over a period of time. So in all of these cases, we basically looked at the literature on apparel, automotive, and electronics over 40 years. So we're not just doing case studies. We're saying, what can we learn when we look at all this new empirical work that have been coming out? And then we set up this sort of a framework where trade policies is the independent variable, so to speak. And trade policies can either be restrictive policies like tariffs or quotas, or they could be facilitative policies like trade agreements. So it's interesting that you take a policy, break it into its key component parts. Then we wanted to know, how did those policies affect the strategies of key firms in these supply chains? So that's a connection to international business literature. And then a kind of a dependent variable was, how did the organization of the global value chain itself change in terms of both the geography and also what the organizational configuration was. So this was trying to lay out a fairly simple framework, and then we gave three industries, and all I'm going to mention, in each industry, we did a table, somewhat like the one I have down here, where we were saying we have to break that industry into at least several time periods, and we give what the time periods are here. In the case of the apparel industry, the key trade policy that was most important was quotas and tariffs coming from something called the multi-fiber arrangement. It was set in place in the 1970s. And multi-fiber arrangement basically said that for countries like the US or Europe, they could set tariff levels for different countries around the world in order to favor some countries to import tariffs or apparel versus others. And so this policy led to a really rapid geographic spread of this apparel industry. And then in 2001, the multi-fiber agreement was phased out, actually in 2005, and we got to a consolidation again. But notice in a case like this, we talked about all the different countries that were involved as key exporters in apparel. And it starts out with even quite advanced countries today, like Japan, becoming initial apparel exporters in the 50s and 60s, and then they move across the chain. but different sets of countries entered the industry at different points in time. Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan were a first set of very successful exporters in the late 60s and 1970s. Later, less developed countries, relatively, China, Indonesia, Thailand, et cetera, came in. And finally, there's another set, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, that were relatively late entrants. So point one, if we're looking at global value chains that are spread across a number of countries, how can we group those countries so that we can begin to see interesting patterns? And then this kind of a chart just shows how, over time, the earliest countries upgrade by moving to the higher value added stages. So this part is important. The value chain includes garments, which is the end product. But if you're going backwards, textiles or fabric goes into garments, fibers goes into textiles, and machinery goes into making all of that. So the most advanced countries in the chain do all of those steps, less advanced just do apparel. So there's lots of different things that come out of looking at the apparel case. Automotive, as I said, also had a key trade policy. Remember, we sort of forget, but in the 1980s, Japan was spectacularly successful as an exporter, and there was a lot of literature on Japan as number one, almost comparing Japan then to, say, China today, the kind of impact that it was having. And so countries like the US began to try to restrict Japan's exports to the US market using a trade policy called voluntary export restraints. And it wasn't just Japan, it was Japan, then Germany, then South Korea. So a lot of the countries began to develop really strong auto industries by producing at home and exporting overseas. The point of these trade restraints was to create a barrier at the border that would stop these imports. But the reaction in this industry was exporting countries like Japan or Germany went from trading with the US to setting up automobile plants inside the US. So that gave rise to a big regionalization dynamic, so that today about half of US auto production comes from international companies, German, Japanese, French, et cetera, and half from US suppliers. So trade policies can have an unintended consequence of increasing domestic competition if countries jump over that system. And then in electronics, it's a different case still. There was another trade policy called orderly marketing agreements, again, another restriction, trying to protect US producers from advanced production, especially in East Asia, but later in Europe. And again, it had some counterintuitive results. There was something called the US-Japan Semiconductor Agreement that created a really important sort of organizational shift by lead firms in the industry that said, instead of having a vertically integrated semiconductor company like Fairchild Electronics, it did its own R&D, did its own production of semiconductors and final products, the industry split into two kinds of companies. Fabless companies that would design chips, and they would buy from other companies that would just produce silicon wafers, and then the other companies that would market the end product. So this difference between the foundries that would make products like the chips and then these fabless companies totally changed the role of suppliers and lead firm strategies. And it created a much more dynamic industry because you didn't have to be a giant firm to get low-cost chips. You could bring in really innovative companies. And so this was a different pattern. So we wanted to just show how three different kinds of trade policies in each industry resulted in different changes to the supply chain. So that's one kind of analysis where you take the industry as a whole, we look for patterns across time and across countries in order to draw some conclusions. Now, let me go to the final main part of industrial policy, being a new kind of policy. So that previous article, trade policy. Industrial policy, so on the industrial policy side, we're back to we talked about 21st century trade in an earlier slide, and that also introduces the 21st century industrial policy debate about how supply chains can be strengthened. In the US context, in the Biden administration, they took this supply chain set of issues seriously and focused on these four industries: semiconductors, electric vehicles, active ingredients for pharmaceuticals, and rare earth minerals. And their concern was, how can the US government introduce its set of industrial policies to strengthen these kinds of industries that were disrupted by COVID and some of the other broad factors? Different ways. The concept came up about resilience, or using the term resilience to make supply chains stronger, and different ways you could try to do it. You could make supply chains more domestic, bring back some of that offshore production to home. You could make them shorter. You could be producing offshore, but produce in neighboring countries like Mexico and Central America for US, or Eastern Central Europe for Western Europe. You can make them more diversified by reducing dependence on any one set of country, and you could make supply chains more digital. The key in this supply chain resiliency debate was, the initial reaction was, if supply chains are global, let's just bring production back home in a big country like the US or a China or a Germany. But it turns out that even for the biggest countries like the US, supply chains could not be reshored and maintain the capabilities you had when you spread production all around the world. Not just labor costs, but more importantly, technology, which is one of the issues Fabrizio was referring to. And another distinction was this notion of resilience had to be distinguished between resilience from a company perspective, which from their point of view meant operational efficiency. How do you manage cost constraints? Supply chains could also be defined, resiliency could be defined in terms of the entire supply chain itself, governance structures or configurations. And very importantly, from a country perspective, how does changing supply chains affect national security? How does it improve national security? And that's one of our key issues. In the Biden administration, several big policies, the ones listed here, in the first couple of years, where he put a lot of money into this in order to try to create incentives or subsidies for companies to rebuild supply chains in the US. That was kind of a big concern of US industrial policy: strengthen US supply chains by bringing them closer to home. And this is then the last part of the last couple slides. So what does that look like in Mexico? One of the obvious places for the US to bring supply chains closer to home is to bring them to a nearby country like Mexico that's highly diversified industrially. And so one of the kind of changes that's been occurring in this literature is a new set of concepts have been coming out about the shifting geographies of supply or global value chains. Offshoring was the initial concept of moving production from one country to other countries to reduce cost or to serve offshore markets better. Reshoring was bringing factories back, sort of unwinding the offshoring process to some degree. Nearshoring was saying, well, if you can't bring everything back to the US, if you can't bring every pharmaceutical product back to the US or other items, you could at least move them closer to reduce some of the cost considerations and to increase some security. And then there's been concepts like friendshoring. So US might deal with allies, let's say like Japan or South Korea, that aren't close, but they're strategically closer to a US vision. And the same would happen for other countries, what they would consider friends. And there's now been a concern with security shoring, that in the case of the US and Europe, perhaps certain countries in the world are considered to be strategic rivals. So you want to be careful not to have too much production in countries that you don't consider a friend. The point, and just a couple of slides on Mexico, because just like in the US, Mexico is in flux right now, but nearshoring is nothing new for Mexico. US and Mexico, because they share such a long common border, have always had a lot of cross-border production. It started out with things like this border industrialization program that allowed Mexican workers, well, first the Mexican agricultural workers could go to the US in the Bracero program. This border industrialization program, you could have twin plants that could share production across the border, where cheaper Mexican wage rates were used, and other kinds of policies, including NAFTA, the free trade agreement involving US, Mexico, Canada. All of that was a form of nearshoring, but the kind of nearshoring that's being discussed today for semiconductors or electric vehicles or pharmaceuticals is really different for these. One is scale. These new industries like semiconductors or electric vehicles have really large, technologically sophisticated firms that are coming into the US. So for Mexico or Canada or any other US partners to create production in a nearshoring way, they'd have to match that scale. They have to do it very fast. This has to occur. The Biden administration has been concerned about spending money quickly. A new administration, as we know, is coming into power with Trump in January. A lot of competition wants to get into the US market. They all want to take advantage of nearshoring provisions, Canada, Australia, et cetera. Resource nationalism is a concern. Countries want to control their own natural resources. And in Mexico's case, they've got a new president who's just inaugurated on October 1. She's got a new agenda, and the US is going to have a new president. So all of these things make Mexico's ability to link up to US industrial policy difficult. And I just mentioned that cross-border supply chains have a lot of surprises or unintended consequences. One, in North America, if you look at US imports from Mexico, they have about 40% US content, meaning US firms have sent components to Mexico. Those get put into engines or other products that are shipped back to the US. Canada has about 20 US imports from Canada have about 25% US content. So if the US just wants to put tariffs against products coming in from those countries, it's actually going to hurt US producers. And resource nationalism, to jump to the last, is also an issue. Mexico has some lithium. Lithium is used in smartphones as well as electric vehicle batteries. How is the US going to deal with Mexico's nationalization of lithium? So last slide, to just give a sense of some of the issues Mexico's confronting in trying to match US industrial policy. And there's a similar discussion for Europe that we could have, or for East Asia. Mexico has a few options. If they wanted to pursue nearshoring in US terms, they would have to have an active industrial policy to build up complementary Mexican industries that could match the needs of these semiconductor firms in the US, or electric vehicle batteries. And that's going to require investments that Mexico has not been making under the previous administration. Mexico could go the economic nationalism route, where they can take key industries like lithium, but that's going to introduce constraints, because one of the critical issues with lithium is that China is probably the most efficient global producer of electric vehicle batteries. They want to set up a plant in Mexico, but the US won't let any imports coming in that have any Chinese content. So economic nationalism is not easy for Mexico to develop. And then finally, Mexico could try to do some kind of strategic balancing. While they maintain ties with the US, they still can say, we want to develop relationships with China, India, and other country partners, and try to come up with some new arrangement with the US. I think all of this gets made more difficult with an incoming Trump administration, because from what we know from President Trump's first term, he is very much pushing an economic nationalism agenda for the US. So this is where this research agenda will have to take some new turns as we try to figure out, how would a new US administration with a new set of policies, how is that likely to affect supply chains in North America, but also affects global supply chains? What does that mean for European Union partners? What does that mean for Asian countries? So I think the industrial policy topic is still going to be with us for a good number of years, but the questions and new policies are going to force us to change the global value chain map a lot in terms of how we do our research. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Giureffi. It has been a very insightful presentation, and sorry again, and many apologies for interrupting you a couple of times.
No.
Or either technical issue or just some time concern. I think that now we can leave the floor to Professor Jennifer Bea to introduce the discussion. Thank you, Jen.
Great. So thank you. And thank you, Gary. Thank you, Fabrizio, and the organizers of this seminar. I'm going to be super brief because I would like to leave time for Q&A and hopefully provide Gary an opportunity to share some more insights in his answers to the questions. I really just want to make 2 points. And the first point I think is an obvious one, but it is an extraordinarily uncertain time in terms of the future of GVCs. Gary mentioned the resurgence or the return of industrial policy. And what's interesting to think about, I think, at this moment is the way in which the Biden administration approach to industrial policy and the way that it thought about increasing resilience in GVCs may change when we see a new administration come in. Industrial policy can be a tool to promote economic nationalism. It can also be a tool to promote resilient supply chains of the sort that we know are important to build, particularly after the COVID epidemic. Those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they do have perhaps different nuances in how policy might go about trying to approach the configuration of global value chains. The one point that I think is important to make is as we think about just sort of the empirical phenomenon of GVCs and the percentage of kind of global trade that what we might consider GVCs represents, it had actually, looking back now, I think there's some consensus that probably as a percentage of global trade, the way that GVCs are measured, that they probably peaked somewhere around 2008. And then there was a bit of a decline, first due to the financial crisis, even before the onset of both kind of the Trump turn more towards economic nationalism and the COVID crisis. So what's interesting, if you go back and look at the 2018 World Bank World Development Report, you really kind of see already in that report, certainly an anxiety about the degree to which Trump's trade policy and other sorts of geopolitical developments might hinder the further proliferation of global value chains. But you also see a recognition that in some sense there had been a bit of perhaps a decline in global value chains and a real concern on the part of the World Bank and the other, I think, international financial institutions about what that could mean for the future. The relationship between industrial policy and trade policy is another area that I think will be really interesting to watch in the coming years with the transition to a new administration in the US. Gary mentioned when he was talking about the apparel industry, which is a particularly stark example, I think, of the way in which GVCs are sensitive to trade policy, that you can think of trade policy in some sense as bifurcated between more restrictive policy and more enabling trade policy like trade agreements. But even in trade agreements, we often find a sort of interesting mix of a more restrictive and a more enabling facet, because something like the North American Free Trade Agreement included rules of origin that were specifically designed to encourage the consolidation of regional global value chains within North America, with production sharing between Mexico and the U.S., specifically designed to kind of counter the threat of Chinese inputs being used in Mexico as an export platform to the U.S. market. So it will be interesting to see as we move forward if there is an effort, again, under the second Trump administration to further mobilize, as Trump attempted to do in the revisions to the NAFTA and the creation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, to use sort of trade policy to pursue essentially the ends of bringing more production back into the U.S. or back into the hemisphere. One of the areas that I'm thinking a lot about right now are actually agricultural supply chains. And I'm thinking in particular about labor as an input into global value chains. And we usually think in global value chains about goods moving or materials moving, but actually in agricultural supply chains, if we look at the US, it's actually people moving into the US that fuel those value chains. And increasingly, there's been an effort to expand the number of folks moving into the United States under temporary worker visas called H-2A visas, on which the US agricultural sector is growing increasingly dependent. So again, it will be very interesting to see how kind of economic nationalism and what might be more of a kind of fortress America approach to thinking about value chains, how that fares in the reality of a real dependence in the U.S. economy on foreign workers to actually fuel what are, I think, for many people, a critical supply chain in terms of resiliency and sustainability, which is the food that we consume. The last thing I just want to say is that whatever happens in terms of the empirical trends with regard to global value chains, the analytical value of the framework, I think, is only going to continue to grow. If you think about the slide that Gary had that sort of laid out the key conceptual dimensions of the framework, mapping the GVC in terms of the actual kind of inputs and outputs, the transformation into a final product, governance structures, the distribution of value added, and state policies. All of those things will continue to be critical in understanding value chains, even if the geography of those value chains are somehow kind of shrinking or becoming more regionally consolidated and less dispersed in the sense of what we might think of as the kind of the classic global value chain. So all of this, I think, is to reassure everyone that your time reading Gary's work is well spent, and that the tools of global value chain analysis, whatever happens sort of in the real world, as we analyze those chains, are going to be very helpful to understand what is likely to be a pretty interesting couple of years coming up. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, so let's move it to Gary, do you want to say anything, or can we open it up to questions?
Open it up.
Great. Okay, so
I
I'm
think
going to try
Fabrizio
to.
had a hand up or something.
Great. Fabrizio?
Yeah, I have three questions. So I want to start out by your last statement, because Jennifer, I'm a little bit more uncertain about your certainty concerning the structure of value chain, and one issue that I want to pose to you and Gary and all the others is the relationship between protectionism and global supply chain. My intuition is that protectionism is going to affect severely the structure, the length, the composition of global supply chain. And so if protectionism is going to develop, I don't know too much about Asia to be able to tell you, but I know enough about Europe for sure, and the US to tell you that if protectionism develops in Europe and US as it seems to be doing, then the structure of the chains in 4-year time will be totally different from what they are now for exogenous variations that are essentially associated with political rather than economic choices. The second question I want to pose goes back to one slide that Gary put on, and that's the slide. That's the slide with offshoring, nearshoring. I don't know, Gary, if you want to put it back on or not. And now, without nothing derogatory about what is descriptive about things, the slide seems to be rather descriptive than normative. So I want to challenge, I don't want to challenge you, I want to deepen the normative dimension of these 5 variables and trying to understand with all of you what are the costs that each of these categories is trying to minimize. So my first question is whether we could write the slide, a twin slide of these 5 different types, where each of these model of shoring is associated with some kind of economizing factor. And so I want to know whether it is possible, of course, the world is way more complex than a single factor. So when I mention one factor, it is not the only exclusive factor, but would be the dominant factor of each of these. And whether, in your opinion, where my explanation concerning these 5 strategies based upon economizing one factor, explaining the change between one and the other by having the predominance of one economizing factor prevailing over the others, so that, for example, at one point, reshoring prevails over offshoring if economizing labor costs is something that at one point is not so relevant any longer, and other factors like security, stability, or other dimension are way more important to economize than the factors. And the third question is also about one slide that you presented, which I think is very important, and that is the distinction between resilience of a firm versus resilience of a chain. This is a key dimension, I think, and I don't want to take too much time out of the discussion to illustrate my example, but in the automotive industry, there is one of the best explanation of how resilience of a chain and resilience of a single commodity, meaning a type of car, can explain the differences between the two concepts, and also the consequences in certain areas. If you want to change the structure of the chain, and so you basically want to undermine the resilience of the chain vis-a-vis the resilience of the single commodity, the factors that you put in place to modify and basically change the resilience are very different. Now, the consequences of distinguishing both analytically and theoretically the resilience of a commodity versus the resilience of a chain modify dramatically the structure of the chain.
Great. Thank you, Fabrizio. I'm actually going to go ahead and take a second question, if that's okay, because Rebecca's hand went up and it may be a related question. Yep. So, Rebecca, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Professor Giurisprudenza, for your very informative presentation. And thanks to the organizers for setting up this wonderful group with 2 really guest stars of the global value chains. So my question is perhaps not totally related to those of Professor Cafaggi, but perhaps aligned. So in your presentation, you mentioned the transition from trade-related policy to industrial-related policy, and this brings back the state when analyzing the implications for global value chains analysis and research. And thinking about the state, I could not resist to think about one of the crises that state will face, especially industrialized economies, which is the demographic crisis that is going to affect the EU and is already also affecting East Asian industrialized economies. And so I was wondering, in relation to your most famous distinction between buyer-driven and producer-driven value chains. So with respect to buyer-driven value chains, if this demographic crisis will affect consumption as a driver for global value chains, and how do you see, if at all, any affection also to the governance and to the geography of global value chains in the light of this coming change? Thank you.
Great. Gary, do you want to take those two? And then we'll do
Yeah,
another
let me
round.
just respond quickly. So let me start with Rebecca, actually, because that's a more focused question. I think this demographic crisis is coming up a lot as a critical new factor that countries maybe have not thought about. And one of the surprising things about the demographic crisis is it used to be something, let's say, people would point at Japan or South Korea as countries that had fertility ratios that were 1.5 or 1.6 instead of 2.1. Italy is actually the second worst country in terms of a low fertility ratio with 1.4, and it's happening in all the advanced industrial countries to some degree, even China, of course, which has this very large labor force, but they're very concerned about the fact that the fertility ratio is not at a position to allow them to replace their existing population. So I think from responses to that, I mean, there's actually debates on how to interpret that ratio and everything, but two things. Role of the state. I think one is the role of technology. One of the things governments are doing, and China has been doing it for a long time, so has Japan, and others, is pushing automation of different sorts, or mechanization. In other words, using technologies to reduce the amount of the role of the labor force needed to produce certain goods at certain stages of the chain. Another key issue is immigration. So for countries in, let's say, Asia, like China, where China and Japan are both pretty dramatic because you've got situations where you have middle-aged males, let's say in their 40s, who haven't been able to find a partner. And so then the question is, and suicides are connected to that, and many other social problems. So I think countries could selectively bring in immigrants, and even China is doing that to some degree. So those are two factors, immigration policy and technology policy, that can alleviate some of that, but that doesn't address the bigger concerns that as populations age in advanced industrial countries, the connection between the resources needed for the aging population and the size of the working population gets out of balance, and how countries are going to deal with that. So let me just leave that as a really key topic we could spend half an hour easily talking about. It's a great issue. Let me then go to a few of the topics that Fabrizio mentioned, and Jen may want to weigh in as well, but quickly in the end. The first issue was around protectionism and some of the uncertainty that's being generated in these supply chains or value chains. And I think that to me, that it's a question of what are the protectionist tools that could be used and these new industries that are being realigned. And the old types of protectionism, like the trade policies I mentioned in those first examples, things like quotas or tariffs or orderly marketing constraints. I mean, that's one set of issues, but clearly we're going to need way more sophisticated instruments. And I think the subsidies right now that the US is introducing to encourage semiconductor firms to come into the US, or pharmaceutical companies or electric vehicle battery, that's another form of protectionism in some key way. In a sense, part of what industrial policy is doing is it's raising the entry cost, so that the European countries are very concerned that these US subsidies are so big that they're making the European companies go to the US rather than stay in the EU for electric vehicles. So I think we have to broaden our notion of policy instruments and tools that are now being brought into play around issues of protectionism. The point Fabrizio made about that one slide being normative, the different types of shorings, and like what cost is each, this slide that's on the screen right now. I think that that's relevant, but and I think that would be a nice way to elaborate more fully something like this, building it out. But I would say, sorry, pardon?
Before you get to the second point, I just wanted to understand whether in the distinction you're making between tariffs and subsidies is underlying the idea that subsidies are discriminatory. Does it make any difference if everybody subsidized only American firms are subsidized? Because it is one thing that the entire industry is subsidized, including foreign countries, and that's a very different type of protectionism than the one where discriminatory subsidy policies are made and only American are subsidized.
So I think there's two ways that discrimination comes in, and they're both operative. One way is for some of these U.S. subsidies, like on vehicles, there was a Made in America provision. That's clearly discriminatory. In other words, if anybody wants to come in and build these industries, you have to source from the United States. Canada, Mexico, EU quickly jumped in. For Canada and Mexico said, well, we've got a US, Mexico, Canada agreement. So with the regional trade agreement, how can you say made in America, a US made provision? So the policy writers adjusted it and said, okay, made in North America is okay. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how these policies are being adjusted. But I think there's another kind of discrimination, which is a scale discrimination. So Europe has a big electric vehicle industry, probably more sophisticated in many ways than what the US has. But they're saying, if your subsidies are so much bigger than what we can offer as smaller countries, we can't compete. Canada already said, we can subsidize at the US level only one firm, and they subsidize Volkswagen to come in and make electric vehicles in Canada. But Canada said, we can't play this game for 5 or 6 companies the way the US can, and other countries can't play the game at all. So I think we have to have two different kinds of discrimination. One specifically targeting to maybe geographic jurisdictions that are also built into some of these policies, like the Inflation Reduction Act and transportation bills. You have to make things in the US or in North America. But I think scale itself is a form of discrimination when you can't match what the US is able to offer. Just jumping to this other slide about the normative question, I think it definitely would be useful to fill out a chart like this with some other factors and what types of cost, et cetera. But to me, one of the critical issues from a GVC point of view is if you say reshore, we have to now be much more specific. What exactly do we want to reshore, and which kind of products? So if we say antibiotics, 90% of antibiotics are being imported from India and China. Is that a good or a bad thing in the US? Some people in the US would say, well, hey, that's a bad thing. That's too much reliance on those countries. But if you talk to the medical profession, they're going to say, well, a lot of antibiotics are very standard drugs. So let's talk about active ingredients. Which active ingredients, which semiconductors do we want to make in the US? So I think because of what we know about how supply chains work, a big policy question is developing supply chain expertise in governments to be able to discriminate between different kinds of intermediate products and things like that. So I think it's, and it's not just labor cost issues, by the way, but it's also, one final fact, technology variable again. For semiconductors right now, the US is pushing these companies to make semiconductor plants that can produce semiconductors at the 3 nanometer or below level. Mexico can't hope to produce that, but they're saying there's legacy chips at the 20 nanometer or 26 nanometer that Mexico could make. So these very technical issues about scale of technology are being redefined in terms of what countries can do. So let me just stop there. Jen, maybe you had a comment, and just to see if there's any other questions. I know your time is short.
No, I mean, just I think super quickly, the question about, the degree to which we will see real effects on the configuration of GBCs, which is, I think, where Fabrizio's question started. It's always worth making an obvious point, I think, that, we often talk about GBCs as a geographical phenomenon, but the original governance distinction between buyer-driven and producer-driven GCCs was more about the organization of the chain in terms of relationships between firms. And that is not necessarily obviated by changes in the geography of the GVCs. So just to, again, sort of underscore the point that it's a multidimensional analytic framework, and it's interesting to think about, changes in one dimension impacting the others, sometimes, but not always, and in complex ways. Okay, I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions.
Yeah.
Paul, I see you put a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, there we are. So
Thanks.
can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
So we've been talking about technology as sort of a means to optimize production distribution as a type of innovation. But what if technology is the product itself, in terms of, so software is being developed by different actors in different stages in different regions, perhaps. But much of the work you've done, which is terrific, right? I use it as well. It focuses on commodities, on stuff we wear, stuff we can touch. What about software as such? What about AI systems as such? Right? These also develop in value chains. To what extent do you see that sort of literature develop there? And if you want to link it to issues in responsibility, liability, how would that sort of work out, given that there is always a degree of control of what we would consider lead firms, say OpenAI or Microsoft and so forth. So I would be happy to hear your perspective on this.
Let me just give
Can we
a quick
take one more,
answer.
Gary, can we take one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Daria.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for this amazing webinar. Thank you, Professor Giureffi. So I come from a competition law background, and I think competition law has not really been spending much time on global value chains, pretty much because we're a little bit stuck with this neoclassical narrow idea of market, even though we absolutely have to embrace a broader dimension of value chains, especially in the light of what you just said, that trade has been globalized, but then you also can see firm level concentration, and UN Trade and Development is talking a lot about export concentration being on the rise, which creates kind of, commodity dependence, which is not resilient at all. So I would really like to hear your opinion on what is the role of competition policy, like how can competition lawyers and policy analysts contribute to this field of GVC research, where we can bring in, we understand the need to change within ourselves, but then what are the possible ways for us to change to be able to, help out with the whole GVC agenda? Thank you.
Great. Okay, great questions. I can give two quick responses, and Jen, you might want to wrap up or whatever. On Paul's point, fortunately, even though a lot of the early GVC work began with goods like apparel, autos, electronics, and others, agricultural products, there's been a tremendous amount of GVC work also on services and on intangibles. Things like tourism and artificial intelligence is indeed coming in as one of the hot new topics that are relevant. And software systems itself is both a product and a service. So I think that this is where the work on the digital economy is really important, because the digital economy is changing a lot of the building blocks of supply chains and introducing far more intangible goods and things. So short answer, I think we can take all of these topics of interest, turn them into value chains in their own right, identify who the key companies are that are making these, who's affected, what kind of workers are involved, and how does this impact parts of more familiar chains. So I think that's all part of a good research agenda. And Daria, in terms of competition law, this is another really hot topic in the US and in Europe as well. But in the US, in the Biden administration, he hired a very sort of aggressive person in the International Trade Commission, Lisa Khan, who has targeted Google, for example, as one of the companies that by classic definitions is violating a lot of antitrust legislation. And the argument is for Google to be broken up. Had Kamala Harris been selected as president, there would have likely been a continuation of pressure on some of these big tech companies in terms of how are they fitting with competition law, and especially data privacy issues for all those big tech. I think with the new Trump administration, that's going to just be rolled back very quickly. But I think from country to country, the role of this policy probably ties into the type of administration and also how do we modernize sort of competition law to deal with companies like Google and Facebook and the others. I think there's a whole new range of issues we need to tackle. And I'd look for countries around the world that seem to be doing interesting things if we're trying to get a sense of where the frontiers might be.
Great. I would just add really quickly on that very important question about competition law. One place that you do see a conversation around this, particularly in the U.S. and the way in which competition law can be, from the vantage point of certain of labor advocates, an impediment to certain kinds of efforts, is that when you have efforts, for example, in apparel, to try to get a group of buyers to agree around particular kinds of standards, often it implicates questions of price, and that then very quickly becomes subject to sort of antitrust concerns. So there's some really interesting debate about that. The other point that I would make is that you do see, again, I think that 2018 Rural Development Report is really interesting because it sort of acknowledges that this question is linked to the debate about upgrading. Because what it sort of points out is that, you have the rise of the so-called superstar firms, and increasingly evidence that a lot of the value capture is happening there in ways that have consequences for, other actors in the global value chain, particularly platform and tech firms, but not necessarily exclusively. And so particularly when we look at the degree to which, we would like to tell a story about how global value chain integration and upgrading is possible, you have to kind of reckon with the degree to which consolidation is perhaps becoming a little bit of a bug kind of in that story. So lots of great work to do, I think, is where I want to end. I want to end the conversation. Thanks so much for the questions, and I will turn it back to Paola.
Many thanks to everybody. I think that everybody here has the feeling that has learned a lot, and also that it would be nice to continue this conversation, probably not today for time constraint, but another time. So we are ready to continue this discussion with you in the coming events. Probably Federico now shortly will show the presentation of the next appointment. Of course, Fabrizio Cafaggi and Federico for helping us organizing and thinking and designing all this initiative. And see you next time, already next week, actually, with the Professor Papakia and Professor Dadush on this screen. So thank you very much for being here today, and see you very soon. Thank you
very much. That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Jen. Good job.
Bye, Gary. Thanks. It was fun. Let's do
Bye.
it again.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Bye, Flo.
Hey, Florence. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Gary, thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio.